In the summer of 1878, a contractor working under the Army Corps of Engineers was lifting the wharf off the bottom of the Savannah River. Above Fort Jackson, laid straight across the channel, was a line of cribs, log boxes packed with stone, and the sunken hulls the Confederates had put down in '62 to keep the Federal fleet off the city. 13 years after the shooting stopped, Savannah was the second cotton port in the country and could not bring a loaded steamer to its own wharves. The method was simple, and it was ugly. A derrick barge on 4 anchors, a chain drag worked across the bottom, and a diver in a closed copper Siebe helmet lowered into water where he could not see his own glove. The Savannah carries peat and silt down out of the interior. The light in it ends about a metre under the surface, and on the bottom the man worked entirely by hand. Find the timber, pass the sling, signal on the line, come up. And between those timbers, across a few weeks of that work, the drag and his hands brought up 9 brass instruments. Not ship's lanterns, not door hinges, not sheathing. Instruments, with a case, with glass, with a dial. Brass in that water goes black-green, and the first one was taken for a piece of broken housing, until somebody scoured it with wet sand and saw a face underneath the crust. Then a second, then 7 more. The maker's marks on them were different shops, different decades, 50 years of spread between the earliest and the latest. One thing was identical on all 9, and about that one thing the contractor's paperwork says nothing, because there is no paperwork. The contract was for the removal of obstructions to navigation. Payment ran by the cubic yard of timber and stone raised. Anything that was not a log or a rock never entered the accounts at all. The 9 instruments went into the hands of the crew inside the month. What was on them is known only from what those men told people afterward, on the riverfront, for years. All 9 dials were set to the same reading. I am not going to give you that number now. We are coming back to it in Block 7, when it is clear why that number should not have existed in 1878. To understand what a drag was catching on in 1878, you have to go back to a morning in April of 1862 on Tybee Island at the mouth of this river. Fort Pulaski stood on Cockspur Island, brick 7.5 feet thick, the most modern coastal work the United States had built, and by every professional opinion of the day, it could not be reduced from the beach a mile away. Union batteries opened on it with rifled guns. Rifled artillery throws a spinning, elongated shot that strikes the same square foot again and again instead of scattering across a wall. In roughly 30 hours the wall was open, the shot were reaching the magazine, and the fort surrendered on the 11th. That single day ended masonry fortification everywhere on Earth, and every coastal fort in Europe became obsolete in an afternoon. But the part that matters here is what it did to Savannah. The mouth of the river was gone. The city was 15 miles upstream, with nothing between it and a fleet, and the response was immediate and total. Crews drove pilings across the channel. They built cribs, heavy log boxes, floated into position, and sunk with stone until they sat on the bottom like teeth. They took merchant hulls, brigs and schooners, and river steamers, filled them with ballast and opened their seams, and put them down in the fairway. They strung it all together above Fort Jackson in a barrier meant to stop anything with a keel, and they left gaps in it that only a local pilot could thread, so their own blockade runners could still slip out at night. It worked. No Federal ship came up that channel for the rest of the war. And it kept working long after there was any reason for it to, because a city that has choked its own river cannot open its own throat again, and Savannah spent the next 15 years trying. Cotton came down to a port that could not take a deep ship, which meant lightering, bales onto shallow craft downriver, transferred again at anchorage, every bale handled 3 times instead of once, every season for 15 years. Subscribe now, because the thing about that barrier is what went into the water with it, and none of that was ever written down either. Here is the physical fact that makes this story possible at all, and it is not exotic, it is high school chemistry. Put 2 different metals in salt water and touch them together, and you have made a battery. Current moves. One metal corrodes and the other is protected, and which is fixed by where they sit on the galvanic series. Iron sits below copper and its alloys. So an iron hull with brass fittings bolted through it is a machine for destroying the iron and preserving the brass. The hull gives itself up to save the hardware. Bury that in the Savannah's mud and the second effect starts. The mud is anoxic. There is no free oxygen in it. Biological activity is slow and starved, and copper alloys in that condition build a tight, dark patina that seals the metal underneath and then does very little for a very long time. Iron does the opposite. Iron in salt mud swells into concretion, a lump of oxide and shell and sand that keeps the shape of the object and none of its substance, so that when you finally lift it, you are holding a fossil of a bolt. It is why a diver on any wreck in warm salt water finds the same picture, an iron fastening reduced to a lump of shell and oxide, and 18 inches away, a brass rim, a brass bushing, a brass hinge, dark as tar and perfectly sound. This is why the wreck field in that channel behaved the way it did. The vessels went to iron stain and soft timber. The stone stayed stone. And the small brass things that had been screwed to bulkheads and set into cabin panels came up in 1878 with their cases intact, their glass sometimes intact, and their movements sealed inside. The glass is the weak point, not the metal. Plate glass of that period is brittle, and a chain drag is not gentle. But glass either survives or it does not, and it does not selectively rearrange what is behind it. A river that erased a fleet handed back the instruments. That is not luck, and it is not mystery. It is a rule. It works the same way today, and it means one very specific thing for what follows. Whatever those 9 dials were showing when they went under the water had no way to change it. A dial is not one hand. On the instruments that were coming out of that channel there were 2, and the difference between them is the entire case. In 1844, a French engineer named Lucien Vidi built the first aneroid barometer, a sealed metal capsule, partly evacuated, that flexes as the weight of the atmosphere changes, with the flex geared up to drive a needle across a printed face. 5 years later, Eugène Bourdon patented the curved tube that made pressure gauges possible for steam, and between the 2 of them, the brass instrument case became standard equipment on any vessel with an engine or an officer. Now look at the face of one. There is the live hand, which moves on its own, driven by the capsule, and on top of the glass, or set through the centre of it by a small knob, there is a second hand, usually plain brass, with no mechanism behind it whatsoever. That is the set hand. It is a marker. You turn the knob, you lay it exactly over the live hand, and you walk away. And when you come back, you can see instantly how far the pressure has moved and in which direction. It cannot drift. It cannot be pushed by the weather. It has no power source and no linkage. It sits precisely where the last human being to touch that instrument put it, and it will sit there until somebody moves it or the glass breaks. And this was not an obscure feature used by specialists. It was routine seamanship. You set the hand at the change of the watch, and the man relieving you read the gap. The older mercury instruments in those cabins did the same job with a different part, a sliding vernier scale worked up and down beside the column by a rack and pinion, marked by hand, holding its position by friction. Different mechanism, same principle, same fact. Somebody put it there on purpose. Now hold that against the account. 9 instruments, 9 set hands, same reading on every one. That is not 9 mechanisms agreeing. Mechanisms cannot agree because the set hand is not a mechanism. That is 9 deliberate acts by human hands, and there are only 2 ways to get 9 of them to land on the same number. The first way is one night, and this river had one. On the 20th of December 1864, Sherman's army was across the approaches to Savannah, and the city was finished. Moored just off Fort Jackson sat the CSS Georgia, an ironclad floating battery paid for largely by the women of the state, who had organized, held fairs, sold jewelry, and raised something on the order of $115,000 in public subscription because the government could not. The ship was a disappointment. Her engines could not push her against the current of her own river, so she never manoeuvred, never fought, and spent her entire career as a stationary gun platform anchored in the channel she had been built to defend. That night her crew opened her and put her on the bottom rather than hand her over. Other vessels went down with her. Powder was dumped, ordnance was spiked, and the garrison, something like 10,000 men under Hardee, walked north out of the city across a pontoon bridge floated on rice barges laid overnight, taken up behind them. Savannah surrendered on the 21st, and on the 22nd Sherman sent Lincoln the telegram offering him the city as a Christmas present. So there is your single night. One evacuation, one order, a line of vessels scuttled inside a few hours, and every instrument aboard all of them entering the same water at effectively the same moment. It is a clean answer, and I want it to be true, but it does not survive contact with the metal, because the maker's marks the crew described in 1878 were spread across 50 years, and a 50-year spread of instruments does not sit on one squadron of ships scuttled on one night, in one December. Some of what came up that summer was older than the war by decades. Which forces the second explanation, and the second explanation requires you to know what this coast did not have. The United States had no national weather service until 1870. In that year, Congress put the job on the Army Signal Service, and systematic instrumental observation, a trained observer, a standard instrument, a fixed schedule, a telegraph line, began on the 1st of November. Before that, there is essentially nothing on this coast. There are ship's logs kept by masters who recorded what they felt like recording. There is private correspondence. There are newspaper accounts written by men who watched a roof come off. There is no continuous barometric record of any kind for the Georgia seaboard. No standard instrument, no calibration, no agreement on how to write a number down. So consider what that makes an old marine barometer, not a curiosity, not decoration. Before 1871, on this coast, a brass instrument in a private cabin was the only pressure record that existed anywhere, and the set hand on its face was the only way anyone had of writing that record down. Now count what passed over this coast in the blind period. In September of 1854, a hurricane came ashore between Savannah and Charleston, and killed people in both cities, tore the sea islands, drove water into the low ground, and left rice fields ruined. Nobody measured it. There is no pressure figure for that storm, no central value, no eye wall reading, nothing but damage reports and death counts, and the word of people who lived through it. The same is true of the storm of 1804. The same is true of every hurricane that struck this coast before the signal service existed. and the blindness did not end cleanly in 1871 either. In August of 1893, a hurricane came into these same sea islands and killed somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 people, mostly on the barrier islands south of Savannah, and even for that one, the pressure record is thin and argued over to this day. The instrumental history of hurricanes in America begins in 1871, and everything that happened before it is a rumor with a body count, which is why the number those men described matters, and it is why the number is a problem. Here is what I held back in Block 1. The reading they described was 27.2 inches of mercury. Convert it and you get about 921 millibars. Now understand where that sits on the face of the instrument itself. A marine barometer of that period is printed with words as well as figures, so that a mate who is not a scientist can read it at a glance. Set fair, change, rain, stormy, with the words running down as the pressure falls. 27.2 is at the extreme bottom of the printed arc, past the last word, in the dead space at the end of the scale, where the maker never expected the hand to go. A man setting a marker there is putting it somewhere the instrument was not designed to describe. And that is only how it looks. Here is how it measures. The lowest pressure recorded at a hurricane landfall anywhere in the United States is 892 millibars, and that was set in the Florida Keys on Labor Day of 1935. Before 1935, the American record low was around 927 millibars, from the Keys again, in 1919. 921 is under that, which means the figure 9 men described from a dial they pulled out of a river in 1878 sits below every measured hurricane landfall in the United States for the next 57 years, and they had no possible way of knowing that, because in 1878 the comparison did not exist. Nobody had recorded a landfall pressure in this country worth comparing it to. They were quoting a number whose significance would not be established until every one of them was dead. And there is a second thing buried in it. Pressure that low is not whether you stand near, it is whether you are inside of. A barometer only reaches a figure like that if the center of the storm passes across the instrument itself, which means whoever set that hand was not observing a hurricane from a distance. He was in it, on this coast, with the wind dropping into that strange stillness, doing the last useful thing a seaman can do. And there is exactly one way a number like that ends up on 9 faces at once. That way is a storm, and I will come back to it. First, I want to show you what happened the one time this river was searched with modern method, because it is the closest thing to a control this story has. In the last decade, the Savannah was deepened for larger container ships, and the CSS Georgia was lying directly in the way. So between roughly 2013 and 2017, the Army Corps of Engineers, Navy divers from a mobile diving and salvage unit, and a team of archaeologists took that wreck apart and brought it up. The divers worked in the same black water their predecessor worked in a century and a half earlier, zero visibility, current, everything by touch, and they recovered casemate sections, cannon, ordnance, and something on the order of tens of thousands of artifacts, which went into conservation at a laboratory in Texas that specializes in waterlogged material, where objects like that sit in chemical baths for years before anyone can safely brush them. Here is the part to hold on to. Among that material there is brass. There is always brass, for the reason we covered in Block 3. It is catalogued the way an archaeologist correctly catalogues it: fitting, fastener, alloy object, with a context number and a photograph. Nobody was looking for a set hand. There was no reason to. The recovery was an ordnance and structure project on a hard deadline, driven by a dredging schedule and by the fact that live Civil War ordnance was coming up out of the mud, and it was executed well by serious people, and reading the position of a marker needle on a barometer face was nobody's assignment and nobody's question. So the one modern, funded, instrumented look into the bottom of the Savannah River pulled up the exact class of object this whole story turns on, described it accurately, and put it on a shelf. The reports are public, the catalogue exists. Nobody has ever gone back and asked the dials what they said. So let me be straight with you, because this is where I stop narrating. I cannot prove 9 dials matched. The account of that summer is oral. It came off a waterfront, from men who told it for years, and stories told for years on waterfronts get better every time they are told. 9 is a good number. All 9 agreeing is a better one, and I would be lying if I said that did not worry me. The ordinary explanation is that the crew found several old brass barometers in the wreck field, which is exactly what you would expect, and that the rest of it grew. But the ordinary explanation and the strange one both come apart on the same piece of evidence, and it is a piece of evidence you can hold. A set hand does not move by itself. Wherever it is sitting right now is where a living person put it. And if that person was standing in a cabin on this coast in September of 1854, with the pressure falling off the bottom of the scale, then the last thing he did before the roof went was mark the number, and no other trace of that storm strength exists anywhere on Earth. Find one of those instruments, and you do not need a laboratory. You need a cloth and light. And the paper trail is not hidden. It is just unvisited. The records of the Office of the Chief of Engineers are a federal record group in the National Archives. River and harbour improvement files, contracts, monthly reports, the whole administrative body of exactly this work. Savannah itself has an archive full of waterfront paper, shipping registers, and family papers from precisely those years. Somewhere in Georgia, in a case or a cabinet or a drawer in a house, there is a black-green brass barometer that came out of that channel, and behind the glass a plain brass hand is still lying exactly where a man left it before the water came in. Nobody has looked at it in 147 years. The reading is not lost. It is just unread.